Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is Wendy Shaw from FEMA Region 10, and today we're going to talk about leveraging the power of story for local mitigation action in Oregon. And joining me today is Brian, Karin, Laura, and Kate. And Brian, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, this is Brian Eberhardt. I'm emergency manager and project manager for the Multnomah County Drainage District in Portland, Oregon. And through FEMA's other great work in the Pacific Northwest, we've had this idea of using storytelling and stories from our community in the Portland area as tools to raise awareness about flood risk and our levee system. The project we created is called Life Along the Columbia, Stories from Behind the Levee, and we're aiming for a summer to fall public release of this. It is our hope that by sharing people's personal connection to this place and illuminating what the levees protect, the people will be more likely to take action. So, through a public event in August of 2019, we collected stories from 17 volunteer participants. Today, we want to share a part of Sunny Simpkins' story. She's the Deputy Director of Planning, Policy, and Finance for MCDD.
I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and so from a very young age, I've experienced flooding. Growing up there, hurricanes were part of life, lights going out, big rains, and not knowing if you're going to school the next day or if somebody's house was going to be underwater. My first flood, I was 5. It was Hurricane Alicia, and I'll remember that because my little sister was like 5 or 6 months old, and her name's Alicia. And then I went to school for geology and went to school in Austin, where again, there was a lot of surface water flooding from the river there, and we had a lot of dams. And so just kind of understanding the play between where we live and how we always congregate around water, because that's like commerce and ease of having the benefits of being around water, but at the same time trying to do it smartly and not minimize our risk based on also having the convenience of living near water.
Sunny left Texas and made her way to the Pacific Northwest in 2002. She shares about how different the mentality is here from Texas.
One thing that's different about the West Coast and living on a river that has dams on it is that we're more complacent about it, and it's not in the forefront of our mind. So that's when you tell people there is a levee district here in Portland, they're like, what? We don't have flooding. It doesn't happen all the time, but it will happen again, and we need to be prepared and know how to react when it does happen.
As Sunny points out, one of our challenges in the Pacific Northwest is that flooding doesn't happen every day or even every year, so people forget, to get comfortable, they get complacent. It's our hope that by sharing stories like Sunny's about people who live, work, and recreate within our levee system, that we can help mitigate risks to our community, getting them ready for that next flood.
And my name is Kate Skaggs, and I've been supporting FEMA Region 10, the mitigation planning program. And we have been supporting the Multnomah County Drainage District to connect this project to other story projects in Region 10. So previously, starting in 2017, we supported Pierce County, Washington, and Thurston County, Washington, do their own power of story projects. And so this information will be posted between now and next January for you to take a look at their projects as well.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, the levee system in Portland is at the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers. It's at the end of the Columbia River Basin. The basin is the second largest in the United States. It has a series of multi-benefit dams that are used for hydropower, recreation, and most importantly to us, flood storage. The Multnomah County Drainage District manages 3 other levee districts along the southern shore of the Columbia River, protecting around 12,500 acres. That includes a mixture of industrial, commercial, residential, and natural areas. Our 2 most important assets that we protect are the Portland International Airport and the City of Portland's backup water supply. MCDD exists to enhance community safety and support the region's vitality by doing the following. We reduce flood risk through levee and drainage maintenance. We have 12 pump stations and 27 miles of levee that we maintain. We prepare for and respond to emergencies and learn from them, and then build upon partnerships to support that work throughout our region. I'm going to pass it over to Karin to talk a little bit more about our flooding history here in Portland.
Thank you, Brian. This is Karin. So over the last 100 years, The area we serve has experienced 5 major flood events in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and most recently in 1996, which was declared a statewide federal emergency. The city of Vanport, however, was built as a temporary housing project in the managed floodplain to support the shipbuilding efforts during World War II. At its peak, over 40,000 people were crammed in 650 acres. Community stories shared now describe how workers would rotate day and night shifts because there weren't enough beds for everyone. After the war ended, discriminatory policies such as redlining made it very difficult for people of color to live or purchase homes in many areas of the city. As a result, many African Americans remained in Vanport after the war ended. In 1948, on Memorial Day weekend, a railroad embankment on the western part of the system breached, and the entire city was wiped away in a matter of hours. Over 18 people lost their lives. While Vanport happened over 70 years ago, the flood risk is still very real today. We see high water events persist in the spring, which now threaten vulnerable unhoused communities that often camp in low-lying areas. The power of story helps us to build relevance, understand how to encourage awareness, and empower self-preparedness in our communities.
And moving forward with bringing all of the context together from the larger story projects in Region 10 down to the specific project supporting Multnomah County Drainage District and the flood history that was just mentioned. This project took about 1 year, and we are still finalizing the products from it. Started preparing for Regatta last August. We prepared for the individual interviews, transcribing the interviews, moving through internal trainings to help be able to learn how to use story as a risk communications tool. Now we're developing the promotional material to support the audio interviews. This information will be available again as the presentation is posted in case you want to be able to do a similar project within your community.
So these are some of the photographs that were captured during the Columbia Slough Watershed Council Regatta event that MCDD hosted in the summer of 2019. And the Columbia Slough Regatta is an annual festival hosted by the Columbia Slough, a local nonprofit organization that invites over 400 community members to learn about and celebrate the Columbia Slough through canoeing and nature-based activities. The Columbia Slough actually runs parallel to the Columbia River and is within the managed floodplain and falls within the area that the district manages and maintains. At the event, we hosted a storytelling booth to collect stories of people who work, recreate, and call the managed floodplain home. Among participants were community activists working to increase engagement of the Latinx community in sustainability, active transportation, and environmental conservation efforts. Mauricio, pictured on the slide on the top left, has volunteered as a paddle team member with the Columbia Slough for over 5 years, leading paddle trips with communities who had never experienced a watershed before and increasing outreach to the Latinx communities. He shared how important it was for agencies not only to invest in, but also prioritize public education efforts to empower communities to self-prepare and understand how to respond to emergencies. On the top right, we see Ubaldo, who grew up in Mexico City and is now an organizer at the Columbia Riverkeeper. He was unaware of the flood protection systems MCDD managed until a recent event and encouraged MCDD through his own story to think about how to manage infrastructure in ways that consider the impact on the environment, which in turn impact communities, their health, physical, and mental well-being. A group of local organizers called the ABC, or Andando en Bicicletas y Caminando, which translates to walking and biking together, shared their experiences participating in MCDD's annual Bike the Levees event earlier in the year. In the spring, they rode with over 60 community members and toured the levee system by bike to learn about the history of Vanport and the way in which MCDD manages its infrastructure. All of these stories allow us to understand our community's values, their experiences and perspectives, and to share the work that they do. Now we're going to play a short clip of a conversation among the ABC group at the Regatta event.
MCDD organiza un evento de bicicletas llamado Bike the Levees para que los miembros de la comunidad puedan aprender sobre la historia del área y la infraestructura de protección contra inundaciones. En la primavera del 2019, los miembros del grupo ABC se unieron a más de 60 miembros de la comunidad en un recorrido por el sistema de picos. La ruta incluyó una presentación de Ed Washington, quien vivió en la ciudad de Vanport hasta que su familia perdió todo por la inundación a la edad de 10 años.
Él estaba niño cuando pasó ese evento, nos iba explicando qué es lo que había aquí, lo que había, que era fábricas, tiendas donde él se acordaba. Para mí personal me conmovió y yo nunca había visto fotos de qué tan grande fue la magnitud de ese desastre. De una información y así poder tenerlo en mente. Esperemos que nunca pase, pero pues nunca, tampoco nadie sabe si se va a pasar o no va a pasar. Muy gusta la información y así tenerlo en mente y tener algo listo para si es que llegue ese caso.
A mí me da miedo más, porque como siempre ando por acá cerca, vivo cerca y es donde voy a comprar.
Cuando se desbloquean mis hijas las fotos, ellas están como, no va a volver a pasar, y son conscientes de que nunca, que ni en la escuela le habían visto de eso, ellos no lo sabían.
Es muy impresionante con las fotos, de que nadie quiere que pase otra vez, pero estoy mirando que de la documentación de 1894, 1933, Vanport en 38, 96, 64, Navidad, 96, y hasta reciente 2017 ha habido actividades del agua que se ha inundado mucho. He escuchado a mucha gente que se está nervioso, tiene ansiedad de un terremoto. ¿Qué va a pasar a Polen? Siento que sí, eso es algo que tomar a cuenta, pero se me hace que una inundación es más posible que un terremoto.
Yeah, I love that last line where they talk about how a flood is more likely than an earthquake, but doesn't get as much attention. I think it's just really empowering to us at MCDD to keep that in mind, that it's not necessarily on people's minds every day, so we have a responsibility to help people be aware of that. So we collected, as I mentioned earlier, 17 participants' stories, and we edited them down to about 8 that we're going to be releasing this coming fall in a flood risk outreach campaign, and kind of in preparation for next year's flood season. We anticipate sharing these stories at virtual events in our community and like this, as well as through mailers to our landowners and through social media. Here are a few samples of our current materials. Listed in this picture, we have Sunny, who you saw earlier, Colin Rowan, and Jennifer Starkey. Next slide. One of the important themes for the regatta this year that we co-hosted was the Slough is for all. It's the goal of encouraging people from all backgrounds to enjoy nature in their backyard while reducing barriers like access and language through recreation. As a part of this event, we held levee and pump station tours to help people to see how our work impacts and ties into the natural areas that they care about within the urban area of Portland. And our overall, all of our stories have some sort of connection to either living, working, or playing, and often the people share all 3 of those together in their stories.
So one thing that was powerful through this process was not only the collection of the stories and the relationship building we had with those community members, but also a reflection as communication practitioners. So stories are something that help us to connect, to relate to each other, and to empathize with our experiences. And what we learned through this process is that we are all storytellers, even though sometimes we tend to be the ones that may be doing the writing or maybe doing the videography behind the camera. But in order to ethically collect other people's stories and build those relationships, we must be able to share our own. So part of what we did through this process is we hosted 2 workshops. The first was focused on telling our own story and understanding our own biases and our own values that show up in the way that we tell our own story, but then also to create awareness in the way that we might tell someone else's. The second workshop was hosted by a nonprofit partner, the Vanport Mosaic, to help practitioners understand informed consent and how improper storytelling could unintentionally perpetuate harm or systemic oppression, especially for communities who may be sharing stories that revive forms of trauma or negative experiences that they may have had. Both workshops gave people an opportunity to reflect at an individual, organizational, and institutional level, which is essential when you're asking individuals to share potentially traumatic or painful memories. I'm going to pass it on to Laura, who was one of the presenters at that second workshop.
Thank you, Karen. And let's start by thinking about, we all intuitively know that there's lots of power in stories, but why is that? So I like to think about what actually a story is. A story is the building blocks of a community, right? They create a reality. Stories can shape the way we see and respond to communities' needs. So there is lots of powers in this decision that we make in terms of how we represent in communities. Are we going to represent in a way that invites support, initiatives and policies that truly benefit the communities, or we create a narrative that in a way justify or even invites disinvestment, oppression, and erasure of that community? So that's why it's so important to think about a compassionate and ethical storytelling framework. The first step that I like to think about when I embark personally on a storytelling project is considering the power dynamics involved in that storytelling process. Who gets to make the decisions, who asks the questions, who gets to tell the story, who even determines if that story is worthy to be told, who is going to listen. So there's no really magical formula to do storytelling in an ethical and moral framework. And I like to think of it as a messy, a continual decision-making process. Is a series of questions that you constantly have to ask yourself and your team. Again, it's messy, it takes lots of time, it involves vulnerability, and it involves mistakes and feeling uncomfortable. And I think that is one of the main reasons often we avoid this whole reflection. And we tend to go back to the more traditional transactional model of getting stories in a kind of an extractive way. We go out, we need the story for our own purpose, no matter how positive it is, it's still extractional. We tell a story about, in one way, about that community, and we parachute ourselves in communities we often don't have any relationship with, and so we don't have any understanding of. So a more ethical and compassionate framework is one that, first of all, it has to be embedded in all stages of the project and not being an afterthought. We want to think of the questions that I started with from the design stage, and then to think through as we collect stories and then we share them and publish them, and even a step that we often forget of, which is how we're going to archive them and preserve them. So we advocate for a relational framework that holds space for stories, tells stories with and not about, and again, it's a place where we honor and acknowledge people's experience, and we celebrate their strength and their resilience. We often talk about the legal aspect of storytelling, right? We talk about the informed consent, and we have all our paperwork ready to go, and that is critical, obviously. But think about that, the informed consent process also from a moral, ethical standpoint. that document and our commitment to preserve the dignity of our communities and to elevate their experience, that is what that document is about. And so it's a human relationship, right? And I like to remind myself and all of us working with stories that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right and we should do it. So go in with your heart and let's tell stories together.
Thank you, Laura. It's been a great year working with FEMA and Vanport Mosaic on this project, and we're excited about the next steps and continuing the momentum going forward for through our fall 2020 flood awareness campaign, by weaving stories and risk communications into our hazard mitigation plan that we're doing for the first time, and by continuing to build on these relationships and partnerships, like with the Vanport Mosaic, to help our community ultimately be better prepared for the next major flood event. So to sum up the project and our experiences with the workshop, we wanted to share a few kind of closing thoughts from the project perspective. Ultimately, we strongly believe that story is a powerful risk communications tool, that data by itself or maps is only so effective, and so stories can help support behavioral change. Another thing is that story projects should be community driven. They should come up from trust and relationships, and we should have not too much of an agenda when we approach these. The questions that were asked by the interviewers to them was to keep them open-ended, to see what people wanted to share and to learn what people cared about in our community. And then when you get down to the nuts and bolts of this, I think a few things to keep in mind are that it's difficult at the beginning of a story project to know what you're going to hear, especially when you don't have a really tight agenda. So establishing clear goals with all the people that are involved in the project, and also being willing to iterate and live with uncertainty is really important. Also, to do informed consent, like Laura talked about, and so did Karen, it takes extra time. So you should plan on it's taking longer than maybe is your ideal, keeping that in mind. And lastly, we wanted to say that part of ethical storytelling and working with partners and local community leaders is, we should be elevating their voices and not trying to broadcast our own. And we should also be compensating people. In this case, we gave everyone who told us their story an emergency kit to walk away with, just as a little thank you for giving us something of themselves.
Hello again, everybody. So Wendy Shaw from FEMA Region 10, and I'm an engineer in the risk analysis branch, focusing mostly on floodplain studies and mapping. And I'd like to just kind of wrap this up and how this all fits into FEMA and our risk management directorate priorities, and then especially Region 10. Our goal in Region 10 is to translate those priorities from our headquarters into action by getting to know our communities. And this storytelling and the way of capturing people's personal information about flood especially is a great way to do that. And communications and outreach is definitely part of developing those hazard mitigation plans. As Brian mentioned, they're working on updating. So at Region 10, we try to focus on some creativity within that risk map process. And you'll see on the slide, the yellow arrows indicate opportunities where we have found a connection point in that we can start communicating a little bit differently, not so much on the regulatory side of developing the flood insurance rate map, but definitely looking more towards what is that risk awareness, what kind of mitigation activities can be done towards that, and how do we develop and encourage resilient communities. And so as you can see, we at discovery, at scoping, and of course the multi-hazard risk assessment, so when we're expanding beyond just a flood study. And then, of course, the resilience workshop, which is where this project with MCDD really got going, was after the 2018 Multnomah County Resilience Meeting. So I'd like to really just take this opportunity to thank Brian and Karen, Laura and Kate for all their hard work on this presentation, and then their hard work in their communities, and the never-ending pursuit for the community awareness and action and resilience. Thank you so much for attending this presentation.